Hi. For the last couple installments of my Bible Rocks series, I'm going to do two parts on the same thing, the same person actually. I think that a lot of us can relate to the rock in the Bible. Not Dwayne Johnson, the original rock. He was a guy named Peter, but actually his first name, his original name was Simon. But he was given the name Peter, which means Petra in Greek, by Jesus, which means the rock. He was also known as Cephas, lots of other things. You know how it is. Some people have lots of different names they have given to them. But with a name like the rock, given by Jesus, you would think he must have been Mr. Stability. So I'm going to walk you through Peter's life, at least the part that has to do with Christ. First of all, in John chapter 1, the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, tell the story of Jesus, but they also tell the story of a lot of Peter's life. He was first of all brought to Christ by his brother Andrew. Now, Peter and Andrew were part of a fishing group. There have been some people who said that Peter was a businessman. Other ones said he was a blue-collar worker because he was just a fisherman. We don't really understand all the dynamics. He had a small business of fishing on the north end of the Sea of Galilee. But as a fisherman, it was very interesting how Jesus used that play on words when he called Peter and James and John and Andrew and said, "I will make you fishers of men." Using a word picture, using a metaphor that they understood very well. Now that challenge to become fishers of men instead of fishers of fish gives a great picture of what God wants us to be doing. But anyhow, back to Peter, the rock. Capernaum, if you ever get there, you'll get a chance to see that the foundation for Peter's mother-in-law's house is still there to this very day. And it's there where Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law. And it's also there on the north end of the Sea of Galilee that after a night of not catching fish, because that's when the commercial fishermen would go out, they came out in the morning, and up on the seashore, Jesus said, "Cast your nets on the other side." And they did, and they had a miraculous catch of fish, which made quite an impression on Peter. But you can read about that. You can read about all these things. You need to read all of the Gospels and the book of Acts to get the picture of Peter. But after that miraculous catch, you get to the point where Jesus did add that extra name, not just Simon, but you are now to be called Peter, the rock. Now, during that time that he traveled with Jesus and with the other disciples, it was the time where Jesus raised a girl from the dead, which is a pretty spectacular thing. It's also an echo of what will be echoed later on. But it's during this same time in the same part of the world there on the north side of the Sea of Galilee that it was during one of the storms when Jesus came walking on the water to where the disciples were in the boat. Now, these disciples were expert fishermen. They were expert boaters. And they were out there, and Jesus came walking across on the water, and it's a very fun story to read. But Peter said, "If it is really you, then tell me to walk out to you." Now, there are some that complain about Peter's lack of faith because as he was walking out toward Jesus, he got distracted by the storm around him. And the moment he took his eyes off Jesus, he went blub, 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 and started going under. And Jesus reached out and took his hand, and then they were in the boat again. But some people give Peter a hard time because of his lack of faith, but the reality is none of the other guys got out of the boat. So anyhow, we have Peter walking on the water, and it's around that same time that they headed up north a little bit to Caesarea Philippi. And that's a place where I talked about on one of the other Bible Rocks, by the way, where it was a place at Caesarea Philippi where there was this big cliff, and there was a pond underneath called the Gate of Hades. And anyhow, that was a place where there were all sorts of false gods, and people would argue about who the real God was. And Jesus said, "Who do people say that I am?" And they talked to him about it, and he said, "Who do you say that I am?" And it was Peter that said, You are the Messiah, you are the Christ." And Jesus said, yes, Peter, and on that rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not stand against it. Now, Jesus said that while he was in front of a place where they talked about what God was which. He was in front of a place where the gate of hell, at least in people's understanding, was. And there's been a lot of debate through the years when Jesus said, and on that rock I will build my church. Is he talking about building it on Peter? Or is he talking about building his church on the truth that he is Messiah? Which is where I happen to believe it is that he was building it on that truth. And Jesus, just like that play on words of calling Peter the rock when he was not always such a rock, and we'll get to that in a moment, it was a bit of an ironic name, I think, sometimes. But also because Peter had stated that foundational truth, Jesus said, yes, on that truth I will build my church. All right, so it's not long after that we begin to see a little bit of Peter not being quite as stable and not quite the rock as what we might think, because Jesus told his disciples, he said, I'm going to go and I'm going to be rejected and I'm going to be crucified, and on the third day I'll rise from the dead. And Peter rebuked Jesus. So that's not going to happen. Now, we tend to say, how could you ever do that to Jesus? Remember, in one way, these were all just a bunch of buddies hanging out together. And when Jesus said, I'm going to be killed, Peter said, over my dead body. And Jesus said, get behind me, Satan. Yeah, that rock was not so stable at that point. Then Peter, James, and John were taken up on the mountain with Jesus at the point, it's called the Mount of Transfiguration, and that's where Jesus appeared with Moses and Elijah, and he took on his heavenly appearance. He took on his glorified appearance. And immediately Peter began babbling and saying, oh, this is such a wonderful thing. We're going to build shelters for all three of you. And God spoke from heaven and said, essentially, Peter, be quiet. Just listen to my son. You see, Peter was a very passionate man. And sometimes, with some of us, our passion gets in the way of what we're supposed to be doing. All right, so after that, Jesus had the conversation at the Last Supper with all the disciples. He said, Peter, you're going to deny me. And of course, Peter said, well, even if everybody else denies you, I will never. Yeah, right. Mouth came first rather than the actual actions. And it was a short time after that, well, it was around that same time that Jesus was washing their feet. And this actually came before he predicted the denial. And Peter said, you shouldn't wash my feet. And Jesus said, yes, it's right that I do this. And he was demonstrating humility to them. And Peter said, well, if you're going to wash my feet, you also should wash my head and my hands. Oh, Peter. Oh, Peter. By the way, back to that church thing. Maybe the church is more like Peter than what I thought. Anyhow, they got out to the Mount of Olives, and there at the Mount of Olives, Jesus said to Peter, James, and John, will you guys pray with me? And what did they do? They slept. And then when the time came for the arrest, it was Peter, rather than trusting what was happening with Christ, he pulled out a sword and he cut off Malchus's ear, one of the servants of the high priest. And Jesus said, oh, put your sword away. And then Peter and all the other disciples ran away. And then during the trials, Peter had opportunity to stand up for his love for Christ. And just like Jesus had predicted, he denied him 3 times. Not such a rock. But on the morning when Jesus was raised from the dead, the announcement came to where the disciples were hiding that Jesus had been raised. And Peter and John ran to the tomb. Now, as we read, it says, Peter ran, but John was faster, so John got there and looked in the tomb. And then Peter pushed past him and actually went right into the tomb. Because after the denials, after his passionate outbursts, I think he was really aching bitterly over his rejection of Christ. After that, it says that Jesus appeared to Peter first. 1 Corinthians 15 talks about that. Fast forward a little bit and you see that what happened is Peter and the other guys went back to fishing. Instead of continuing as fishers of men, they went back to fishing for fish. So as they were in the early morning, they looked up on the shore and there was Jesus up on the shore. They didn't recognize him. He said, "Come on up." But he also helped them to have a miraculous catch of fish that time. And then when they got on the shore, Jesus took Peter, the passionate one, and he said, "Peter, do you love me?" Peter said, "Of course I love you." He said, "Feed my sheep." "Peter, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord, I love you." "Then feed my sheep." "Peter," he asked a third time, "do you love me?" Why would he need to be asked 3 times? I believe that God, in his grace, his lavish grace with wisdom and understanding, he was reminding Peter, "You denied me 3 times, but I affirm, and I give you the chance to affirm 3 times that you really do love me, and I forgive you." There's an awful lot about Peter, an awful lot about the rock, even though an awful lot of times he doesn't look much like a rock. So I'll come back again with the next section of this.